the coolest vision of having all of these capabilities in one tool is eliminating conform. I mean, as a producer, that's going to save me money. As an artist, that's going to save me hassle. As a director, it means I can ask Edit to make changes that aren't going to completely screw up color and audio. It just opens up a smoothness of workflow potentially that moving projects from one application to the next, and then going back when you need to make a change is never going to do.
Director, writer, and colorist Alexis Van Hurkman joins me on this episode of the Colorist Podcast. There's been many twists and turns in the career of Alexis Van Hurkman. He bounced around from audio, editorial, graphics, and visual effects. And ultimately, each of those steps in his journey contributed to his skills as a colorist. Along with grading his own projects, he's finished programs for the History Channel, the Learning Channel, BBC4, and WNET. Many listeners will recognize Alexis's book titles, the Color Correction Handbook, the Color Correction Lookbook, as well as the manuals for Apple Color, Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. He's also created several training titles with Ripple Training, featuring the newest features in Resolve. We talk about the complicated path in becoming a colorist, how writing has increased his color knowledge and skills, how he ended up working at Apple, working with and without a color control panel, and how the Fairlight page affects colorists today. And now, here's Alexis Van Hurkman. Thanks, Alexis, for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate you making the time.
Sure, happy to.
You had a really diverse background. You've worked in production, post-production, and you've done a lot of writing as well. They've all been part of your experience. So how did you make your way to being a colorist?
Completely by accident, as is the case with a lot of colorists. It's something you kind of tend to fall into, I've found. My first job in the industry was in video as an editor. This was in the 90s in San Francisco. I actually hadn't even intended to be a video editor. I was really into sound design. My first internship that I did when I got into the industry was at a place called Focused Audio that used to do a lot of the sound design for Liquid Television, that MTV Liquid Television show that had all the cool animations.
I remember it.
Yeah, it's funny. I say that to a lot of people and they're like, what? And it's like, oh, you're younger, aren't you? But that was a great place to learn about the industry because it was a small boutique facility. The deal was really simple. You know, I striped tape and swept the floors and cut the bagels. And in exchange, I got to sit with the second engineer and the first engineer in client sessions and observe. And the first engineer, especially a man named Jay Shilladay, was really cool with the interns, and he really went out of his way to share information and went so far, like, you know, once he got a sense of who you were and that you weren't a complete idiot. I remember him even, you know, sort of asking me my opinion once in a while in the middle of a session with a client there. You know, what do you think about this mix? Oh, it seems a little bright. Oh, that's a, you know, good observation, and away things would go. And through that experience, honestly, half of what I've learned about client service, I learned at that internship by having that opportunity to sit and watch artists drive the session with commercial clients. But that didn't end up to me getting a position there because they just weren't expanding at that time. And you know, I scouted around San Francisco and just there weren't a lot of openings for staff. So I did a little bit of freelance audio work, but it was very hit and miss in between my day job at the time. And then the first job I got, job in post, was when I was working on a film of my own. And I was using some brand new video digitizing hardware at a place called the Bay Area Video Coalition. And I had taught myself Premiere. I think this was Premiere 2.5 or 3 at the time. So I was doing my thing, and someone came up to me and said, hey, you know, you seem to be able to drive Premiere pretty well. And I'm like, thanks. And they said, would you be interested in doing freelance editing work? And I was like, you know, after a long string of disappointments trying to find other gigs, I'm like, how much are you going to pay? And they're like, oh, $25 an hour. And I'm like, $25 an hour? This is 1993. Hell yeah, absolutely. I had been video editing my projects. I learned editing on flatbeds, cutting 16. I learned tape-to-tape editing. So I'd just newly been exposed to nonlinear editing. Funnily enough, where I'd done my audio internship, that was my first introduction to nonlinear editing because they had an AMS audio file. 16 tracks of digital audio. And funnily enough, a custom control surface for audio editing. That was my first exposure to digital editing. So I kind of started with this awesome stuff, and then everything got lower rent from there. So even though I hadn't set out to be a video editor, I knew how to edit, and I'd had client experience, and I could deal with the audio better than most. And so I just kind of fell into that. And the other thing that got me more gigs was I was willing to take on visual effects work because I was interested. I really abused Premiere's feature set pretty harshly to do this science fiction movie I was working on. That's what drove it. I've always been wanting to do these hard projects with visual effects that were almost beyond what I had available to me. And I would just try and find ways of making it work for my story. And then I would accidentally end up with these skills that I could use for these corporate communications gigs that I kept getting. So anyway, that was my first deal. And then to cut to the chase, from there, my clients wanted more and more After Effects work out of me. So I ended up teaching myself After Effects. And when I discovered I could charge more for doing After Effects work and people wouldn't be sitting over my shoulder, I'm like, I am now a broadcast designer. I'll still edit it if you need me to, but I'm a broadcast designer now. And I focused on that for the next 3-4 years. And then I took a break from the freelance work I'd been doing because I had finally finished the first screenplay I wrote that I felt was worth pursuing as a project. And I thought, freelancing and fundraising together seems like a profoundly terrible idea. And I fell into a position at Apple, which was coincidentally also the beginning of my technical writing career. I had never set out to be a technical writer, but through my involvement with the Bay Area Video Coalition, I had been teaching even in the 90s, but 1 and 2 day seminars on After Effects or editing or video technology. And I always wrote my own syllabuses and handouts. And of course, I was a screenwriter. So when I got to the point where I was at Apple and my friend Brian Meany, who was the product designer for a long time, said, hey, I really hate the existing manual. Would you help the team make another manual? And I was like, oh, sure, I guess. This was the transition from Final Cut 1 to Final Cut 2. And that manual ended up being 1,200 pages and a giant project. And I basically just took it over because I guess I had a knack for it. So the writing came naturally. And really, that's what led to me getting involved with color, because it was version 3 of the Final Cut Pro experience where they added very DaVinci-esque 3-way color correction tools. I had never considered myself a colorist. I'd putzed around with color, but mainly just, RGB sliders, right? Nothing serious. I always thought color was for the special people that had mystical abilities. Because back then, what color suites were like. They were millions of dollars. They were elite facilities that only well-heeled people could afford. Indie filmmakers like me, putzing around with shorts, nah, no chance. There's no way I was going to have the money for that. So here I am being told, well, we're going to add these color correction tools and you'll have to add a chapter. I'm like, well, shit, I guess I got to learn about this. What was great about that experience for me, and I've told this story before, is that an acquaintance of mine who I met at a contract that I did for Alias Wavefront before I was working at Apple was an engineer, and he was the engineer responsible for the technical underpinnings of all the color code. So he really understood the math, and he understood the technology, and we were friends. So we would talk about it at length, and he would be very open with me about how the technical side of things were working. And at the same time, the team made available to me, and I wish I could remember his name, because he was a really great guy. I believe he was the lead colorist at Veritel in San Francisco at the time, which is no more. Veritel is gone. But I sat with him for a series of interviews, and he talked me through his creative process. So I had this technical crash course on the one hand and a creative crash course on the other. And then I had the opportunity to run all of this information through and turn it into instructional guides, right? I maintain there's no better way to learn a subject than to write about it. Because if you don't understand it, you're not going to be able to write a successful chapter. So you really have to get to a point where you understand it well enough to be able to explain it. And at that point, it's kind of set, like concrete. It's not going anywhere. Once you've written about it, that knowledge won't just evaporate. So that was a phenomenal experience. But even then, I didn't consider myself to be any kind of a colorist. I just knew a little something about color correction. And I had maintained a clientele for the time that I was working at Apple because I wanted, I knew I was going to go back into freelancing eventually. I didn't want to lose all my clients. I wanted to keep a hand in creatively, so I would continue to have ideas and things to say about the software. And over time, my editing clients that themselves were kind of drifting out into different states away from the Bay Area stopped coming to me for editing, but started coming back to me for some of the little color adjustments that I'd been making to their programs, just as a matter of course. You know what it's like. Once you learn to see the problems, you can't not see them. You can't ignore it. And you're like, let me just fix that black level for you. So I was doing these little things and people were responding to them. And the more people asked, the more I did. And the turning point for me was really finishing my first feature film that I did when I was in Los Angeles. And at the end of that project, I thought, I might be good enough to color correct my own movie, but I don't know if I am. So I'll give it a whirl, and then I'll show it to my harshest critics, the colleagues I have that are willing to tell me when my shit is terrible. And if they tell me my grading is awful, then fuck it. I'll hire a real colorist and that'll be that. But if they like it, then I guess I will have gotten away with it and I don't have to pay for it. Hooray. So I did. And it's funny because I spent like 3 weeks on that project, and it was a short feature. It's like 74 minutes long, I think. But I was so terrified of doing something wrong. I mean, again, anyone who's gone through the process of learning about color, I think will relate. When you're first doing it, you're like, oh man, am I making this better? Am I making this worse? I can't even tell half the time. Like, am I doing this the right way? Am I compromising the signal by doing too much of something? I don't even know. So I was really careful, and I graded every scene like twice or 3 times just to make sure I was doing the best matching I could do. And at the end of the process, I showed it around, and the response was really positive. And I'm like, I guess I got away with it. Maybe I could do more of this. Like you make your indie films and you take them on the festival circuit and you hope to make some magic, and usually you don't, or you make a little bit of magic, but you still have to go back to your day job, right, while you develop the next project. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have a day job, I think color might be an interesting place to go. My background in effects work, my background in editing, and my background in story kind of all dovetailed in this nice confluence of activities that constitutes color correction. Because really, color correction is a little bit of compositing, it's a little bit of storytelling, and it's a whole lot of creative judgment. Having embraced Shake and having done all of my effects by myself for my feature in a node-based environment, I really got tuned into the sort of atomic level compositing methods that engenders. I think node-based compositing really opens you up to image processing in a way that After Effects doesn't quite. At least it gets you thinking in a far more methodical way than I think After Effects does. And I'm not saying this out of hatred for After Effects. I used it for years and years and years. It remains one of my favorite programs. But it's about a different vibe of working than the node-based experience is. And so that also contributed to, I think, making it a little easier for me to drill down a little more deeply. Like once I decided to take color seriously, that's when I really started doing a lot more reading. Reading about image processing, reading more about human vision, reading more about the video signal and signal processing, while at the same time putting my shingle out to do a lot of low rent jobs that I could get access to as someone who was really at the beginning of that part of my career. But happily, I'd already had the client service experience to be able to interact people without embarrassing myself. That made it a lot easier for me to get hooked into jobs more quickly because I knew how to sit with people and I knew how to, take their feedback and have a smoother session. At least I didn't have to relearn that. But after doing a handful of small projects and then being lucky enough to get involved with some indie features, I got to the point where I was ready to leave Apple. And my wife was already living in New York at that time. We were having a bi-coastal relationship because her work as a stylist was really in New York while I was busy in Los Angeles. And I decided to join her in New York, because it seemed to me like that would be an easier place to start a new business. All the clients are a little more concentrated. And I liked the New York vibe. I'd never lived there before, so I wanted to see how that went. So I went to New York, and that was basically when I put up my sign as Alexis Van Hurkman Colorist and formed my own suite, which it was at the first point where people could do that. And I started meeting other people who were doing the same thing. Like Patrick Inhofer was one of the first I met in New York. He had similarly a one-person suite that he was running for color. And he was only a few blocks away from me, actually. So once we got to know one another, we'd start having lunch. And it's funny because we'd get a lot of the same clients. Someone would call me and get a quote, and then I wouldn't hear back, and we'd have lunch. And I'd be like, hey, did you get a call from blah, blah, blah? He's like, oh, yeah. And it was like, huh. Call you back? And, and sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's all random. We were part of this new wave of individual colorists setting up micro boutique shops.
Yeah, the most interesting thing is that at that time it was actually possible, because prior to that, as you were saying, these were $1 million suites.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, you needed massive investment and you needed to charge a lot, which meant you need a sales force. And the truth is, even at the boutique level, that's still true. My biggest problem as an individual creative is that I had to do all my own hustling. So when you're really busy, guess what? You don't have time to hustle. All of a sudden things drop. Now you're hustling. Then it gets busy. You don't have time. It's really tough. I also discovered, and this was one of the things that led to me ultimately leaving New York after 6 years. I got to a point where I was getting a certain level of client. It was okay. It was working out. But I wasn't able to grow very aggressively because I couldn't get those $1 million features. I couldn't get the bigger TV shows, right? The ones that want to see infrastructure, the ones that want to see a receptionist who's going to come and get coffee and the nice coffee maker and all of that, right? And I got to a point where I started realizing that I either needed to take this a lot more seriously and actually create a facility, or I needed to go back to doing what I was supposed to be doing, which was filmmaking and storytelling. And that was really what precipitated the move after 6 years. I felt like I was at the cusp of maybe breaking through in my post career a little more aggressively. But I knew what I was going to have to do to really do that. And it wasn't something I wanted to do. I have never wanted to be a facility owner. That's just never been something that's interested me. It's a tough business. I have a lot of admiration for people who take that on and employ artists and provide an environment where creative work can happen. But, I wanted to make another film. And it's like, I can't do both. So I decided, it's time for me to start refocusing. I love post. I still do it. I've got a weekly show I grade right now. But I want the post work to support the other creative work that I do and not to enslave me, so to speak. Again, I'm a weirdo. I've got 3 totally different yet linked careers that I pursue simultaneously.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to your background in audio too, because I think there's a lot of crossover between color and audio. You already kind of mentioned that, it's client service based. You're interacting with clients. As far as at a technical level, there's all kinds of crossover with what's going on with processing audio as well as processing video. I mean, people do qualifications and there's curves, and they both work with control surfaces too. And the biggest thing that was a surprise, especially to me too, is that there is audio built into Resolve now, with the Fairlight page. What's your take on audio making its way into Resolve specifically? And do you think colorists need to be more concerned with finishing techniques for audio too?
I'll tackle that last one first because my answer is no. I don't think dedicated colorists have to worry about learning audio any more than dedicated audio mixers need to worry about learning color. Because if your clientele is based on you being a specialist, I don't see any reason why that needs to change just because Resolve is capable of doing something new, right? Like, we added editing to Resolve. Doesn't mean colorists suddenly have to start editing, but it does mean the people that support that colorist can use the editing features to help them finish. And it also means that creative editors can start exploring workflows where they undertake the creative edit in this application, and then they reap the benefits of not having to reconform to go to color. Like, literally, they can save a day or 2 of putzing around with, reconforming, and somebody forgot the audio, and these effects didn't go over, and this didn't come over correctly, and we got to redo it. No, if you edit and Resolve and you go into the color page, that's it. You click a button, you're done. That's your conform. But that's not to say that every colorist needs to learn to be an editor, because that's what every single client's going to expect. But that's driven by your clientele. Now, if you're a generalist and you're an editor and you do some color and you know how to do some audio, well, now Resolve is playing to the way you work in a very different light. Like, you actually are capable of driving all the tools. Now they're all there at your disposal. And eventually, when the audio feature set is complete, the process of going from your edit into your audio mix will similarly be a single click, as opposed to, now I've got to export in AAF, and I've got to relink Pro Tools, and maybe I need to reconform all the audio, and then edit made a change, so now I got to cut in all these changes. And no, you don't have to do any of that because it's all operating out of the same timeline. So I have spoken with a few colorists who are like, oh God, now the clients are going to want me to know something about audio. I don't necessarily think that's true, because if you've already established yourself as a specialist, I think it would be a pretty silly client to just go, oh, Resolve can do audio now. Hey, I want this storied person at company 3 to now do my mix as well, right? Yeah. Nobody's going to do that. I hear a lot of people being worried, oh God, I got to learn a bunch of stuff. You only need to learn what your clients require of you, and that's not going to change. And if you've built your business because you've learned a lot, then yeah, now we're giving you something more to learn, but chances are you're going to be the kind of person that will embrace that. But ultimately, for me, the coolest vision of having all of these capabilities in one tool is eliminating conform. That, to me, is the bee's knees. I mean, as a producer, that's going to save me money. As an artist, that's going to save me hassle. As a director, it means I can ask edit to make changes that aren't going to completely screw up color and audio. the timeline gets to be a little more dynamic without causing huge problems. It just opens up a smoothness of workflow potentially that moving projects from one application to the next, and then going back when you need to make a change is never going to do. So that to me is the most exciting thing. And it is awfully cool if you're a generalist that you can have one place that can undertake a lot of disciplines in very powerful ways. But it's also very cool if you're in a stable of specialists that you can all work together in a common tool. I think that's just as cool, that the colorist and the audio mixer can actually share a tool and talk and work together in a way that wasn't as fluid before.
So this episode now, as we stand, is the 15th episode of the podcast. And I've talked to a lot of different colorists. And one thing that I've been really surprised by are the amount of colorists that don't use control surfaces. There's, like guys like Peter Doyle and Steve Scott, they choose to work without panels. Do you believe that there's certain projects that require a panel to be used and other ones that don't?
Well, I'm kind of a funny person to be talking to because I do a lot of presentations. And I've found that it's impossible to give a color presentation with a panel and have anyone have any idea what you're doing. Because when you're using a panel, everything's invisible. If I show you the Resolve interface on a projector and I use my panel and I make, let's say, 10 adjustments, right? All you're going to see is the image changing. You're not going to notice things in the UI shifting necessarily unless I change pages on a curve or switch curves. It becomes really difficult to see what's going on because everything's just kind of happening in a blur, right? We were talking about the projects that you were working on. You're grading 1,600 shots in a program, right? And I've certainly been there with reality shows I've graded in the past. And you just got to make a bunch of adjustments and go. It's like playing a sport. If you have to think about how you're going to catch the ball, you're not going to catch the ball. You just have to have practiced it enough so that the ball appears and you just grab it and you don't even know how you grabbed it or why you grabbed it. You just grabbed it, right? Your body knew what to do. And at a certain level of color, if you're going to make your schedule, you need to be able to just dive in and just start doing. And you don't even know what you're doing. You're just doing it. You're just working your way through. And so demoing the interface and demoing grading techniques to students using the mouse has required me to get really fast using keyboard and mouse, right? I don't want to look like an idiot up there on stage fumbling around, where's the menu command and where's the this? And the other thing is because I write the manual, again, I don't use a control surface when I build examples that I illustrate in the manual. I just keyboard and mouse my way through it. So I go through stretches of time where I don't use control surfaces at all, but I'm still doing a lot of different things in the app. And so I've developed a speed and a facility working with the mouse that a lot of my control surface focused colleagues don't have, because they never use it, right? They've gotten really good muscle memory with their control surface so they can work quickly and comfortably doing everything they need to do. I'm not going to necessarily say I'm as fast as them at their fastest, but I've actually had a couple sessions, emergency situations pop up where I just had to jump into a room and do some things where I didn't have a control surface available to me, and I never had a client complain. I can whip through things pretty quickly. I once had a fencing coach tell me, and this was in defense of drilling a technique, right? He said, even if you have the wrong fencing technique, if you drill it enough, you will get fast with it. That's been my experience. Whatever tool you happen to have, if you're forced to have to use that tool, you use it enough, you're going to get fast with it, right? Doesn't matter if it's a keyboard and a mouse or one type of control surface versus another type of control surface, or people who are using gaming pads and mapping them with exotic keyboard sets. Whatever you put your mind to, this is how I'm going to do it, you do enough of it, you'll get fast. So I don't really have a strong opinion about to control surface or not to control surface. I will say in my own color work, I prefer having a control surface. I've used them long enough. I've used many different kinds over the years. Right now, my main control surface is the big DaVinci control surface. Although I dearly love the mini that they came out with. I've got one of those and I've given it a whirl, and it's a really nice layout. But I've got the big one, so I figure I might as well use it. And as I work on the programs that I work on, I use that. I like the tactile feel of it. I feel like it's a little more comfortable. If I use a mouse too much to grade, my hand turns into this claw. That's very uncomfortable. And the other thing I want to point out is I don't have a team, right? I don't have a bunch of people helping me with my grade. On my projects, it's just me. I feel like as a sole operator, that has a feel for the control surface controls. That's just what I prefer. I believe that on the schedules that I have, which are similar to the schedules you have, right? We don't have clients that are interested in us taking 3 weeks to grade a thing, right? We get a few days if we're lucky. Operating on those kinds of schedules, I feel that having a well-mapped control panel with enough simultaneously presented knobs and controls in front of you means that I will be inclined to make more precision adjustments in the same amount of time that I would have made fewer precision adjustments if I didn't have that panel, right? In other words, if I'm trying to get through shots like 15 seconds a shot, if I've got a control surface, I can just zip into my curves and just do a little, right? A little more red, a little less yellow. And it's done. Whereas if with my mouse, I'm, dragging the color wheel and dragging the contrast control and doing this, and maybe I'll do something to a curve, and I'm like, I got to keep going, right? I might not go all the way into the hue versus sat curve. Whereas if I've got a control surface, the knobs are just right there. They're practically begging me to use them. So that's been my experience. I don't feel like without the control surface, I'm necessarily that much slower, but I'm not putting as much oomph into each grade as I do when I have a control surface available to me.
Sure. Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, I came from a symphony background too, where to make a window, it would take 10 steps or something like that in the software to make it happen. Yeah. But when you have a control surface and it's right there and you press one button, you tend to use those things more.
Totally. So I think that's kind of an unheralded advantage. I would never say to anyone, you cannot work professionally if you don't use a control surface. I would never say that because that's silly. I have done so. I know others who do so. Obviously, some extremely well-positioned colorists who are doing so. But I will say that depending on your schedule, they can enable you to put a little more bang for the buck in the same amount of time than if you didn't.
I really enjoyed your color correction lookbook. It's something that I definitely check out. Just go through and try to get ideas. And it's interesting. Dave Hussey actually had a really great quote. He said, "I work really hard to make it look like I did nothing." Our work is all about subtlety, and we're asked to create these looks sometimes that go beyond what's actually been shot. Do you have some technique to strike a balance between, going crazy and still making it look like you're doing really subtle work?
Yeah, my technique is generally to not go crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny, right? I had a ball expanding the section of the first color correction handbook that I did into its own book. Mainly because when I did the second edition, I expanded it too much and I went past the page count the publisher gave me. And I'm like, crap. They're like, well, you're going to have to ax X number of pages. And I said, no, okay, how about we take this technique section and spin it off into its own book? And that way I don't have to get rid of it, but it becomes kind of a volume 1 and volume 2, and they went for it. But as I was working on that, I incorporated a lot of things that I had done for different programs over the years. And I also incorporated a lot of things that I wished I could do. And I find the sad truth for myself is that the vast majority of my clients, they're not coming to me for crazy looks. I don't do music videos, not because I don't want to. I haven't had occasion to get a crack at that kind of work very much, so my reel never reflected it, so people never came to me for it. And I don't do a ton of commercial spots. And those are really the two arenas in which the aggressive look is king, right? I do a lot of documentary, and those clients are not looking for bleach bypass effects. And I do a lot of indie film, and there was a good 9 years where every indie film I wanted, they wanted it gritty. We want a gritty, dirty look. And it's like, yay, this again. And that's not, to me, at least the way we ended up doing it. My experience with American clients is that they say they want a big look, and so you do a big look, and they're like, oh, man, that's too much. I mean, tell me I'm wrong, Josh. What's your experience been?
No, it's absolutely true.
Yeah. They come in talking big. They're like, we want this thing that no one's ever seen. And then you do it, and they're like, oh, man, that's too much. Could you just like warm it up and up the contrast a little? It's like, okie doke.
Well, my theory on that too is you don't know how far you need to go until you've gone over the line anyway. So you're always kind of pushing those boundaries anyway. So
yeah,
and maybe you get to the point where you find exactly what they're looking for. It may just be a kernel of a part of a look that you've made that they're interested in. But the point is, sometimes you have to bash it over the head to get to where you want to go.
That can be true. My experience has generally been that people are big talkers, but they don't want to do that much. And so over the years, I've become disinclined to kind of come out guns blazing. And that actually bit me in the ass because I had the opportunity to do some testing with a Chinese filmmaker named Tsui Hark. He was interested in, maybe using me for a project, but he wanted to audition me first. And I actually had the opportunity to learn from him as a filmmaker. So we had this really wonderful trade where I got to watch him work for 2 weeks, and then we did some grading testing, and he was also interested in learning a little bit more about Resolve. So that was really great. But the first day we worked together, I could tell he wasn't quite satisfied with what I was doing. And by the end of the day, I'm like, God, what is up? Like, usually I figure out where the client's coming from the first half of the first day, right? That's the job. You try to figure out what they want. And I'm like, what am I doing? Do I suck? Am I a bad colorist? And I thought, I've gotten so used to people wanting bold looks and then scaling them down that I tend to not go big right out of the gate. I thought, you know what? Fuck it. Tomorrow, I'm just going to go for it. I think maybe that's my problem. So I came in early, and on this one scene that we were exploring, I knocked out 12 giant fucking grades, right? Just big choices. And the first one of those was the one that I thought was my honest interpretation is what he wanted. And the rest were just me trying variations, just in case he might like to see those. And he came on set, and he wandered by and was like, oh, what do you got? And I'm like, all right, check it out. And I turn on the split screen view, and here's all these grades. And he's like, ah. And he points at the first one, and he's like, that's good. And I'm like, yes, I'm not an idiot. I just allowed myself to get too conservative. And here I was confronted with an A-list client who meant it when he said, I want a bold choice. And so then for the rest of the 2 weeks, it was great. I had a lot of fun. I didn't end up getting the gig for various reasons, but it was a tremendous experience. And I walked away feeling really good about myself. It's like, okay, I've been in a really crazy situation and I made it work. So I guess I do have something to offer after all.
You absolutely do. We were talking earlier too, before we started podcasting, about HDR and your experience with it. Obviously, it's one of the biggest changes that we've had, with color and technology that's changing rapidly, it gives us the ability to make more contrast of luminance or color or saturation. Do you believe that this is going to change the way cinematographers and colorists approach these projects?
That's an interesting question, because I've moved into the camp of those who say that I think you will get a better result from your grade if you spend time thinking about and designing for HDR in your art direction and in your cinematography. So I absolutely believe that that is true. However, I don't think it necessarily requires you to think differently about those things. I think the main thing is you just have to think about highlights in more detail. It's something you need to develop a bit more language for, if that makes sense. And in other words, in Rec 709 and even in P3, which gives you a little bit more, we're familiar with the range of luminance that's available to us, right? And all of the highlights occupy this relatively thin band relative to the rest of the image. And we've all just gotten used to that, right? Where are the highlights? Well, they're like 90 to 100%. Where are the peak highlights? Well, they're like 95 to 100%, right? There's not a huge difference between a peak highlight and diffuse white, if you will. Depending on how you grade. Some colorists like to move diffuse white a little lower so the peak whites have a little more pop. Other colorists, or other situations rather, require brighter diffuse white so that the whole image can have a little more oomph to it, which means that there's less of a delta between diffuse white and your peak whites. But, either way, you're talking about, maybe if you're really, really going for a murky, shadowy kind of thing, you're going to move diffuse white to what, maybe down to 75%, because you're going all 7 on the grade, right? The difference between all those situations is not that great, really. It seems greater than it is because we're used to perceiving a bigger change than is really there, just because we know how little there is. But moving into the realm of HDR, all of a sudden, you're not just talking about the difference between diffuse white and peak white, right? You're talking about the difference between diffuse white and, say, ordinary highlights, and intense highlights, and then specular highlights, right? And all those different kinds of highlights can be at different levels. Whereas before, this whole range of different kinds of highlights were smushed into 5% of the video signal or 10% of the video signal, right? You really weren't differentiating that finely between, say 5 kinds of highlights. You were really talking about 2 kinds of highlights, the bright ones and the really bright ones. Well, now you can have the bright ones, the more bright, the even brighter, the very bright, and then the extremely bright. And you can use that if you've prepared for that. Or rather, it's easier to use that if you've prepared for that. Because my experience grading either pre-graded masters to put them into an HDR look, or grading stuff that was just shot conventionally. The intention was to grade it to 709 or whatever. So no special care was taken with the highlights. Is that oftentimes you find yourself having to create your own managed highlights. In other words, the brightest thing in the picture often is not the thing you want audiences to be looking at, right? Which is the guy's face. No, it's the window behind the guy. And so if you just stretch the signal naturally, well, now you've got this bright window and everyone's looking at the bird outside instead of looking at the guy who's holding the knife. Because nobody thought to put a highlight on the knife because they thought, we want it to be in the midtones, that'll be fine. Well, yeah, now no one's looking at the knife, they're looking at the bird out the window. Whereas if we've got this opportunity to put these highlights at different levels. So maybe we want the knife to be the brightest highlight. And we want his face, or the rim light on his face coming from the window, to be the next brightest thing. And then we want the window to be bright, but not the brightest thing. So you're going to make different decisions. Maybe you're going to care a little bit more about throwing some ND over the window in your lighting scheme. Maybe you're going to go ahead and put a little inky on that knife. And maybe you're going to sculpt the lighting on his face a little differently, because now you don't care about cigarette burns on his face so much, because you know that HDR is going to be able to hold more saturation in those highlights. So you're not going to lose skin tone just because you want a hard rim light on his face. And to anyone who says, we don't like hard lights on faces, I'm like, go out go on a picnic and look at your friends and tell me what you see. Because there's plenty of hard light on faces out in the world. And if you go to an art gallery, you're going to see tons of hard highlights on faces. It's something you can do. And the reason we haven't had it on the menu is because that doesn't necessarily look that great in 709. But now we have an opportunity to finally combine brighter than ordinary highlights with saturation and have a really nice, pleasing integration of those areas of the picture into everything else, rather than, oh God, this is, hard and clipped and it's going to be a little jagged. It's like, no, it'll be just as smooth as everything else because that saturation is allowable.
What I'm getting from what you're saying, though, is that they can plan for a hierarchy of brightness to kind of define where your eye should be drawn. Does that sound about right?
That's absolutely what I'm selling. I think the best way to think about HDR and the best way to use HDR is to, precisely as you've described, think about a hierarchy of highlights and have a differentiation between each category of highlight that you're employing. Now, the other thing I'll say is, just because you can have a highlight doesn't mean you have to. If your intention is to have a dark room where the brightest thing in the room is just this very dim, diffuse white, then that's fine. Like, grade that. Screw HDR highlights. You don't need to have them. But the point of HDR is when it makes sense, when you want it, you can have it. It's another, to paraphrase a debate I had on Twitter somewhere along the line, it's a bigger box of crayons. Doesn't mean you have to use every single crayon in every single picture, but if you're doing a picture and you're like, wow, I would really love to have this rim of light behind her hair, that's just on fire, because that would be amazing. You can do it. And it is amazing. HDR is the most fun that I have had in years, as a colorist and as a filmmaker. And I'll tell you, this last project that I directed and produced, Checksum, I wanted to consider the HDR before the shoot, in pre-production, on the set, during the shoot, to see if I would have a better time grading it. And I'll tell you, it totally worked. The time I took working with Kaylin, also works as wardrobe and art direction on my films. And the time she took pulling garments that had a little bit of sparkle in them where I wanted them to and didn't have sparkle where we didn't. The time the makeup artist used to use shimmer in the right places and to matte in places where we didn't want it. And application of the glossy lipstick in such a way that we've got these really beautiful white edges on the glistening of the lips in some shots, for the close-up. And the sets, the material of the sets, the props that were selected. Every decision that was made about everything on screen was made through the lens of, how is this going to look in terms of highlights? And are these highlights we want, or are these highlights we don't want? And then in the lighting process, we ended up using Flanders Scientific displays, their new DM series of displays, which have their HDR preview mode. which they're not super bright, so it's not like they're showing you 1,000 nit highlights or anything, but I believe they're able to get up to 350 nits, I think. And so you can enable an HDR mode on them, which is basically giving you ST2084 and just letting the monitor clip it. But even with that, and then I got Michael Chenery at Blackmagic was good enough to make me an HDR LUT that I could load onto the Blackmagic Ursa mini camera that we were using on the shoot. So the camera would output an ST2084 signal to the DM250. And so we were getting exactly what Flanders described. We were getting a preview of how the lighting scheme would look with a bit of HDR-ishness applied to it. And that was incredibly helpful. And then also the fact that the monitor had a waveform with the HDR scale, the 2084 scale on it, I found particularly helpful. And so the DP, Michael Handley, it took him a little getting used to the new scale, but because I'd been looking at that scale for a year already now, I knew exactly what I wanted to see in terms of the highlights. I wanted to see a lot of irregularity. I wanted to see a lot of different levels, and I wanted to make sure that, the things that I wanted the audience's eye drawn to had the highest levels. Those were my three rough criteria. And in the spur of the moment, that's kind of all you can think about, right? But he was a great DP, and we had a great lighting crew, and they pulled together some really nice, thought-out lighting setups that when I went on to grade, it was the first HDR grade I did where I didn't, at least on the version of the teaser that I showed at NAB, I didn't have to pull a single secondary to try and create a falsely brighter HDR highlight on the thing that I wanted. When I stretched everything out, everything was pretty much parked where I wanted it, and I just had to decide how bright do I want various things. It wasn't a fight. It was a really nice grade. I should say it was a really pleasurable grade to execute, because I haven't gotten to the final yet. That was kind of a rough test.
And you can't really have a conversation about HDR if you're not talking about color managed workflow to like ACES or TrueLight or even Resolve color management.
Yes.
A lot of people are having issues with ACES, so they did at the beginning, but they're starting to get out of its 1.0 phase right now. Do you think that it's only a matter of time before people catch up with the issues with the workflow? Or do you think that there's specific things that need to be addressed about ACES or any other color managed workflow to have it catch on?
I'm not an expert on ACES. I mean, I've worked with it a little bit. I understand what it is and how to employ it, but I've not had a project where I've been required to use ACES. So I don't have a lot of hands-on with it as an artist. So I can't really speak to the merits or deficiencies of ACES. I will say for the programs that I do, the advantages of ACES don't tantalize me that much. Right now I'm still creating material destined for the film festival circuit, most venues of which are just looking for a QuickTime movie from me. So if I was more involved with theatrical releases and DCP, I would probably be a little more passionate about ACES. But because I'm not, it doesn't necessarily speak to me. However, color management speaks to me. So I've been using Resolve color management on most of my personal work in the last few years since it's come out. I'm a fan, but I also understand how working with Resolve color managed differs both in feeling, the controls feel a bit different, and in workflow from just doing, regular old Resolve YRGB uncolor managed work, just the regular Resolve YRGB color science. So I get why people who turn color management on and then find themselves being resistant, I understand why they are, but I honestly think that it's worth the learning curve or the adjustment phase, if you will, because I think really that's what it is. Things feel a bit different, and you need to get used to a different way of putting your grades together, a different way of thinking about your image processing pipeline. And if you just want everything to be the same as it was before, then yeah, you shouldn't use it because things will be a bit different. But if you allow yourself to get used to the newness, I think there are some, really nice advantages. And of course, when it comes to HDR is practically begging you to be color managed just to be able to output correctly and to be able to move to a different color space and execute a different grade if you need to. Everything becomes so much easier if you're willing to use color management in that scheme. Otherwise, you're still using color management. You're just sort of manually setting it up. The only drawback to color management that I see is there's just a bit of an adjustment that you have to make. The advantages are many. And, it's not magic. It's not like if you go into a color managed workflow, half your grading will be done for you already and, unicorns will sing songs to you. You still have to do the work, but certain things become less onerous, like blending multiple color spaces from multiple cameras together. The gamma can be a little easier to tame between multiple formats. One of the new features in Resolve 14 that I've become a huge fan of, and in fact it completely saved me on one particular program I worked on, is the new gamut transform capabilities. There's now built-in tone mapping and saturation mapping, and it works well. Again, it's not magic. It's not going to grade the program for you, but it will make... the situation I had was I had a 3-camera shoot, and of course, the client shot with a different third camera, and that camera was pointed at a completely different region of lighting on the location than the other 2 cameras were. And so it was just a bear to try and get that angle to match. I was making myself crazy. But moving into 14 and using the new tone mapping turned a really onerous set of grades that I was never entirely happy with into an absolute snap. It was just day and night easier to get the result I wanted with that tool. So I'm a huge fan of that. And I understand that Baselight has very similar capabilities. In fact, Baselight, I believe, was one of the originators of color managed workflows. So they've been at the party for a good long time, and they have a lot of great tools available for that. So yeah, I think color management is a fantastic tool for the colorist, but you got to give yourself a chance to get used to it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, whether it's ACES or it's Resolve Color Management, they've kind of been burned by it, either because they've used it early on before it was ready for prime time, or they're lying to the program about what footage they're actually using, if that makes any sense.
Well, yeah. If you're tagging a bunch of different footage, you need to make sure you tag it correctly.
I think that's part of the problem, too, is in some of the worlds that we both live in, it's, well, this footage is S-Log2. Well, what gamut was it in? There's a lot of details to it, and managing color is a job in itself sometimes.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And part of the issue is, and this is, I'm going to allow myself to be a bit critical. Clients working not at the top Hollywood level, mid-range clients have allowed themselves to become really sloppy with their records keeping. For, as you say, okay, this is the camera you were using. What was the setting you used before you transcoded the QuickTime or MXF, right? What was the curve you used on the camera? And half of the time people don't know. And so you've got to go through this trial and error process if you're using color management. It's like, was it this? Does it look good? No. Was it this? Does it look good? No. Was it this? Did it look good? Well, maybe. Okay, maybe that's it. Let me try another one. And, at that point, you just sort of take your best shot because ultimately you're just talking about a starting point, right? It's not like the setting you choose, if it's wrong, but the result looks fine, is that the worst thing in the world? I'd be happier if it was right, but if the image looks fine and it lets me get started and it results in a good grade, who cares, right? So it's not like it's the end of the world, but it sure would help if every client could attach to the media metadata appropriate to identify what that media is, or at least have a shot log or something that just says, okay, these clips were from this camera, which used these settings. and these other clips are from this other camera that use these settings, and put it someplace safe. So when the colorist asks, what kind of footage is this? Oh, here, let me flip. Yeah, it's red footage from a Dragon, and when we transcoded it, we decided to use red color 2 and red log film. Ah, okay. Now it makes sense. Choose the settings. Everything's wonderful. Like, that's just record keeping, right? And I know people are going to listen to this and they're going to say, man, I don't have time for that. Like, I'm not being paid to do that. And it's like, sure, okay, whatever. But then don't complain when the colorist has to take more time to figure all that out. You know, time saved in one area is going to be spent in another area. It's like a law of conservation of time wasting in production. You can save time somewhere, but you are going to spend more time somewhere else because you didn't do that thing. And anyone who's had the opportunity like me to be both on the production side of things and post can see that really, really clearly. And it's a constant frustration to me to see people continue to make the same mistakes. You know, oh, we'll save some time by just not, forget it. Don't go back to the truck for that bounce card to, you know, get a little more fill light in the interview subject. Screw it. The colorist will fix it, right? And now you're having to window 50 shots, and then they're like, well, why do the faces look so flat and weird? Well, because I had to bring them up with the window. Well, can you put a shadow on one side of their faces? Well, yeah, sure. Like, are you going to give me another day? You know, it's like all you had to do is take 5 minutes and get a piece of foam core. That's all you had to do. And I keep using that example in these interviews, but it keeps happening.
Yeah.
Like every third program I get, it's like, man, couldn't you have bounced in a little fill? Like, honestly, it would have done the world. And, you know, yeah, sure, I can fix it, but
not nearly as good as if it was just done.
Not quite as good. And frankly, and you're going to be spending more money on the extra 2 hours I'm going to spend on this, you know, or whatever. And then every shot has a wandering camera. So you got to track all those windows, right? It's like it never ends. So I always try to drill that into people. It's like, man, think when you say the words on set, nah, don't bother. We'll take care of that later, right? Whenever you say those words, just add $300 to your budget. Just do it, you know?
So the last question I'm going to ask you is about the Color Society. So the Color Society has been around for about a year now. So what's your opinion about a group specifically for colorists?
I think it's an interesting idea. So full disclosure, I had joined the group initially. I was extended an honorary membership as things were just getting started because they were keen on educators getting involved. And, well, I guess I'm an educator. And it was kind of interesting seeing things getting started. I have allowed my membership to lapse, not because I want to get out of the group, but because I'm lazy and I've been really busy and I just haven't gotten to clicking that link yet. But I'm intending on rejoining because I think the group has a lot of potential for advocacy in our community, which up till now has been kind of like herding cats. The job of color correction is interesting because it hasn't had any union affiliations. That has made it, I don't want to say it's been easy to get into, but it's certainly made it more accessible to people in the fringes in the industry to get involved with color. The downside is there's no union minimum, right? How much does color correction cost? Well, it depends entirely on who you talk to. Now, I'm not saying that I think there needs to be a union right now. I am saying that people who are involved with the Colorist Association are people who have been advocating for rates. They've been advocating for, you know, junior people in our community to take their standards and practices a little more seriously and you know, to take a good hard look at their rates and see if maybe they aren't undercutting themselves. And I see a lot of potential in the society to be a disseminator of best practices information and, you know, and yet another opportunity for networking, which is in and of itself valuable. So I see a lot of potential. It's going to be a lot of work. I don't envy the people who are in the thick of it. I mean, I understand that you're involved.
Yeah, I am. I'm a member of CSI as well, and also disclosure that they sponsor this podcast. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's something that all colorists should kind of think about, at least talking with each other about how they're doing things. And I believe there should be some recognition for colorists too. I think that that's a real shame. I mean, I was watching even Handmaid's Tale, and there's not even a credit for a colorist. So
really?
Yeah, which I was
that surprises me.
Very stunned. So
most of the time there's a credit. Wow.
You know, guys like you and me are looking for that too. So as far as like to see who colors what and what they're doing. But, you know, I just think that it's time for something like this to happen. And I'm really thankful that these guys are putting their energy into putting it together. It is no small feat.
I agree. It's an enormous amount of work. So I'll be curious to see how it develops.
Thanks, Alexis, for joining me. It was really, really great to talk to you. So is there any place that people can see your work or anything you'd like to plug? Or?
Well, the most pluggable thing I've got is the website, alexisvanhurkman.com. I am not necessarily the most prolific writer, but when I do get a bee in my bonnet about writing about a topic, they tend to be really long articles. And since we had such a lovely chat about HDR, last year I wrote a substantial article about HDR, what it is, and the creative potential for it, and that is available at my website, alexisvanhurkman.com. For people who are interested in learning more about DaVinci Resolve, specifically version 14, I have a series of training titles on Ripple Training. So you can go to rippletraining.com, and they've got all of my video training around DaVinci Resolve. For people who are interested in what I've got on my mind, I'm at Hurkman on Twitter, but watch out because you never know what I'm going to retweet.
This is true. Thanks again, Alexis.
Sure.